Okay, guys, here we go. So bear with me. This is my first time teaching this way with this kind of flipped classroom, so we're going to have to figure it out together. So we're going to start with Unit 1. Today we're going to do 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, which I know sounds like a lot, but hopefully it won't be too horrible. So for 1.1, our objectives are going to be explaining how resources influence species interactions. So we're going to be looking at predator-prey relationships, symbiotic relationships, including mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, and then competition and resource partitioning. You're going to have a skill that you're going to be practicing at the end, which for this one would be describe environmental concepts and processes. So when we look at ecosystems, they're split into these little categories to make them easier to study. So our smallest category is going to be an individual. So that would be one organism. In this example, it's an elk. Then we have a population, which is a group of individuals of the same species. So multiple elk in this example. Next is a community, which is all the living organisms in an area, including plants, okay? So the plants and the animals that live in the area. Once we start talking about an ecosystem, then we're talking about all the living and non-living things. So you can see in this picture, we've included the little stream, the mountains, the air, all the things that are alive and not alive. And then we have biomes. So these are going to be areas that have similar climate conditions throughout the year, which are going to determine what plant and animal species live there. 1.2 and 1.3 are going to focus on terrestrial and aquatic biomes. Examples would be like the tropical rainforest, the desert, things like that. So our organism interactions, we've got a variety of interactions. And so you're going to see these like negative and plus signs. So negative is going to be that organism is not benefiting from the relationship. Plus is going to be that it is benefiting. And then zero means that it's not benefiting, but it's also not being harmed. So in competition, we're going to have organisms fighting over a resource, food, shelter, mates, whatever. So this is going to limit population size. So because there's not enough for everyone to go around, they have to compete for it. It's negative for both of them because they're expending energy to compete. Predation, so that's where we're going to have one organism using another one for an energy source. So this could include our traditional predators that we think about, like lions, wolves, things like that. Parasites are considered predators, and even herbivores are considered predators. Mutualism, that's going to be where both are mutually benefiting from the relationship. So coral reef is one example. In coral reef, you've got algae and coral working together. Algae is obviously a plant that's going to do photosynthesis. Coral are actually animals, so as they go through photosynthesis and respiration, they kind of provide molecules that the other one needs. And then in commensalism, that's where you're going to have one species benefiting and the other species just really doesn't care. It's not being impacted in a positive or a negative way. So birds nesting in trees is a good example of that. The bird is obviously benefiting. It's got a place to live, but the tree isn't being harmed. So it doesn't really care that the bird is there. So a little bit more about predation. Like I said, herbivores are considered predators, okay, because they do eat something else to get their energy. So giraffe, tree. Obviously, the giraffe would be benefiting from this. The tree would be harmed. Then we have our true predators, which are going to be our carnivores. They're going to kill and eat prey for energy. So that's our things like I was talking about earlier, your lions, your wolves, leopards, things that are hunting down, catching, killing, eating another animal. So in this case, the leopard would be the positive, the giraffe would be the negative. And then parasites, those are going to use some kind of a host organism to get energy. A lot of times they can do that without killing the host. And sometimes they'll even live inside of the host. So mosquitoes are an example. Tapeworms are an example. That's one that lives inside of the host. A sea lamprey, that's what these little Guys right here are on the fish, so the sea lamprey is going to suck the blood from the fish, and that's not going to kill the fish, but it's obviously going to weaken it. Then we also have a group called parasitoids, and those typically will kill or do kill their host. So what they do is they actually lay their eggs inside of the host, and then as their eggs hatch, the larvae will actually eat the host from the inside out. So parasitic wasps are an example of that. The parasitic wasp will actually inject its eggs into the caterpillar, and then when they hatch, they'll eat their way out of the caterpillar. So really good, easy source of food for the wasp larvae, but if you're the caterpillar, not so good. So when we talk about symbiosis, we can break that word apart. So sym has its true meaning is together, bio is living, and then osis is a condition. So this is things that are living together and interacting. But this has to be two organisms of different species. Okay, so any close long-term interaction between two organisms of different species. Mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, those are all symbiotic relationships. So when we have mutualism, we've got different species living close together in a way that's going to benefit them both. So like I was talking about before, with our coral and our algae in the coral reef, that coral is going to provide first a habitat, and it's also going to provide carbon dioxide for the algae, which they need to go through photosynthesis. And then the algae through photosynthesis is going to create sugars that the coral can then use as energy. So they're both benefiting from this relationship. Understand coral, like I said, it is actually an animal. Each individual coral is called a polyp, but it is an animal, so it has to get its energy from somewhere else. It's not making its own energy. Lichen is another example. So these actually function like one organism because they live so closely together. So we call them a composite organism. So it's a fungus and an algae. The algae is going to provide the sugars, same as the algae does up here, and the fungi is going to provide the nutrients for the algae to go through photosynthesis. So competition is going to reduce population size since there aren't as many resources, so not as many organisms can survive. That results in a few different things. Resource partitioning is a big one. So with resource partitioning, you're going to see different species using the exact same resource, but in a different way. And so that's going to reduce competition. So some examples we have here. So with the first one is temporal partitioning. So that means they're going to use resources at different times. So like the wolf and the coyote over here, they're going to hunt at different times. They're still hunting the same thing, but they're not competing with each other as much since they're competing in different times of the day. Then we have spatial partitioning. So spatial partitioning is going to be using different areas of a shared habitat. So here you can see if this is like a desert area, this bush is going to have really deep roots to get the water and the nutrients that are down here, whereas the grass has shallower roots. So they can both get that same resource without taking it from the other one. Here's another example of spatial partitioning with the warblers. They've kind of adapted over time to use different parts of the trees. And understand that this happens through evolution, guys. This doesn't happen like they don't all have a meeting and say, hey, we're going to nest up here. You guys nest down there. Just over time, they become adapted to use different areas of the tree. And then the last one we have is morphological partitioning. So that's where we're going to have different resources being used because of different evolved body features. So when you look at the ferret and the ermine over here, although they are very similar, the ferret has evolved to have a little bit larger canines, a little bit larger skull, so it's going to be able to take down larger prey. So that's 1.1. So what I want you to do in your note sheet is I want you to use this right here, and don't spend a ton of time on this, guys. It's just practice, okay? Identify two organisms that compete for a shared food resource and describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the two organisms that you talked about. Then we're going to move on to 1.2, which is our terrestrial or our land biomes. So with these, our objective today is going to be able to describe the distribution and principal aspects of terrestrial biomes. So where do we find them? What characteristics do they have? So some things you're going to need to know is that biomes have plants and animals that are adapted to their specific climates, that we've got major terrestrial biomes. So these, you guys need to know these, okay? You need to know what the precipitation is like there, what the temperature is like there, what adaptations things would need to live there. You're going to be able to tell me the distribution of these resources like water, trees, and that those things vary because of climate, geography, latitude, altitude, nutrient availability, soil, and that biomes aren't fixed. They are able to move around a little bit, shift a little bit because of global climate change. And then we've got our skill at the end here, which is going to be, once again, explain environmental concepts and processes. So a biome, like we talked about already, is an area that shares a combination of average yearly temperature and precipitation. So it's not just what kind of rain does it have in a day or a week or a month, but it's over a year. So we've got a variety of different land biomes, okay? So rainforest, for example, is going to be, its climate's going to be hot, but it's going to be very wet, whereas our desert, it's going to be hot as well, but it's going to be dry. And whatever animals or plants that end up in each of these biomes are there because they have unique adaptations that let them survive there. If we took something that's used to living in a rainforest and put it in the desert, probably wouldn't survive. So some examples here, camels, they store fat in their humps for whenever there's like a food shortage in a desert. So they're able to have that energy that they need to survive. Cactus, they have water preserving traits like waxy leaves that help to prevent water loss. And then when we look at things like shrubs and wildfires that are going to be living in grasslands, they're going to have these really long roots that are going to store a lot of energy in them because these areas are susceptible to wildfires. So if they keep everything stored in their roots, they're able to survive that wildfire and quickly recover from that. So when we look at these biomes, I need you to understand that they have a range of temperature and a range of precipitation. So when we look at our graph here, our temperature is down here on our x-axis, our precipitation is on our y-axis. So if we look at the savanna as an example, its precipitation can drop all the way down to, I don't know, what is that, maybe about 60, 75 centimeters per year. But it can also go all the way up and peak at like 280, 290 centimeters per year. And then the temperature is going to go anywhere from maybe 18, this would be maybe like 18, all the way up to like 30 degrees Celsius. So they have a range. So you can see the tundra down here. It's going to be our coldest. It's not going to have a ton of precipitation, but our tropical rainforest is going to be the warmest with the most precipitation. So that chart is also able to help us define where these things are going to be found on Earth. It would be a lot of information to ask you guys to memorize the, location, the rainfall, the precipitation, or rainfall and precipitation, temperature, all that stuff for every single biome. That would be a lot. But if you can just kind of remember some of their characteristics, that can tell you where they're going to be found. So for example, when we look at our tundra, it's cold, it's got low precipitation. So using our brains, hopefully we should be able to realize that those are going to be found in those higher latitudes because it's cold there. So they're going to be like 60 plus degrees latitude. Then our temperate, so those are going to be things like grasslands, the seasonal forests that we're used to here. Those are going to be concentrated in the middle of our map, so from about 30 to 60 degrees. They're going to have moderate rainfall. They're going to have relatively warm temperatures, but we do have seasons, so they do get cool in the winter. And then our tropical ones, those are going to be our warm ones. They are getting more of that direct sunlight. They're going to see more rainfall. Those are going to be found closer to the equator. So like I said, don't try to memorize the locations of all of them, but just recognize the patterns in temperatures and precipitation to help you kind of figure out where those things are going to be. So cold and dry, further north, warm and wet, further south. So when we talk about what is the defining characteristic of a biome, we do look at the precipitation and the temperature, but we also have to look at nutrient availability because plants determine what's going to grow. Plants need nutrients, so if we've got good soil with lots of nutrients, lots of things are going to be able to grow. So if we look at the tundra, for example, it's got very low nutrients in its soil because the soil's frozen. There's a big layer of what we call permafrost. So it doesn't allow those nutrients and things that are dying to be broken down by the decomposers. So we've got low soil nutrients, low water availability. So very few plants survive there. There's only a very small active layer in that soil where the plants are going to be able to get their roots to. Now, when we think about the tropical rainforest, we might think that that would have very nutrient-rich soil because it has so much plant life. But the soil there is actually very nutrient poor. And that's because there is so much competition from those plants that essentially, as soon as nutrients get into the soil, they get taken right back out by some kind of plant. Our boreal forest, that's going to have those frozen soils like the tundra, but they're going to be a little more flexible in their temperatures. They're not frozen for as long as the tundra is, but that's also going to lead to nutrient poor soils. The decomposers just can't work fast enough to break down any organic material to replace the nutrients that are being used by the plants. But when we think about things like temperate forests, those are like our forests. So they've got broadleaf plants like oaks, maples. So there's a lot of organic matter that's falling down to the earth to be recycled. So since there's so much falling down to be recycled, we end up having lots of nutrient-rich soil. We've got lots of dead organic matter. We've got warm temperatures and moisture, so those decomposers are able to work fast enough to get those nutrients back into the soil. And understand, guys, when we talk about these plants, the plants are going to determine what animals are going to live there. So if we don't have a ton of plants, like in the tundra and in the boreal forest, we're not going to see as wide of a variety of animals. And then one of the last things we're going to talk about for 1.2 is that biomes are actually shifting location as the climate changes. So climate is not stable, it's changing over time. So as it warms up, we're going to see those northern biomes moving further north because that permafrost is going to start melting, and the lower latitudes are going to just become too warm for the aspen and the spruce plants that live there. I'm busy, go. So you can see here that this is our current climate suitability zone from 1971 to 2000. So you can see that forest was pretty far south. And then from there, our projected climate suitability zone, you can see it's moving much further north, 2071 to 2100, and that's going to be because of that shifting climate. And then this is like a real life example. This would be an Arctic kind of like tundra. And so you can see that it's actually changing based on the climate. So you can see there used to be a lot of plant life down here, but not much up here. But over here in 2004, you can see those plants are starting to move further north. So for our practice FRQ here, I want you to just identify one characteristic of a biome and explain how that characteristic determines the community of organisms that's going to be found there. All right, last one. I know we have a lot to do today. I'm sorry, but we don't have a lot of time. So 1.3 is going to be our aquatic biomes. So we're going to pretty much be doing the same thing here as we just did, except instead of focusing on terrestrial biomes, we're looking at aquatic biomes. So our freshwater biomes are going to include streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, and these are really important sources of drinking water. Marine biomes are going to have the oceans, the coral reefs, marshlands, estuaries, and a really big important fact here to note is that algae in marine biomes is going to provide a huge portion of the Earth's oxygen, and it's also going to take in a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then we also need to know for this one that those natural resources are going to be influenced by a little bit of different things, not so much climate and precipitation, but things like salinity, depth, turbidity, nutrient availability, and temperature. And once again, at the end, you're going to explain an environmental concept and process. So some characteristics of aquatic biomes, we've got salinity, which is just how much water, how much salt is in the water, which is going to determine what can live there and if we can use it to drink. We've got depth, so that's going to influence the amount of sunlight, how far it can go down. The shallower the sunlight is, the less photosynthesis we're going to be happening. Flow, so flow is going to determine what plants and organisms can live there and how much oxygen can be dissolved into that water. Flow is essentially just how much it's moving. If it's flowing, then we're going to have it mixing more. And so if we have more movement, we have more mixture, which leads to more oxygen in the water. And then finally, temperature. Water is going to obviously, the temperature is going to be important for a variety of reasons. But one big one is that warmer water is going to hold less dissolved oxygen. So it's not going to be able to support as many organisms. So with our freshwater, rivers are going to have very high oxygen levels because they're flowing, they're mixing water and the air together, and they're also going to have very nutrient-rich sediments. So as they flow, the erosion that they cause is going to pull some of those sediments into the water. So we're going to see these delta and floodplains having very fertile soil. Lakes, those are just standing bodies of water, so they don't have as high levels of dissolved oxygen, but they are a very key drinking source for humans and organisms. Then we've got some zones of freshwater areas. We've got the littoral zone, which is shallow water right around the edge that has emergent plants. So emergent plants are going to be things like reeds and cattails. They can survive. They have adaptations that allow them to survive with their roots submerged in soil that's underwater, but their body is going to be out of the water, okay? We have the limnetic zone, so that's where light can reach. This is where a lot of photosynthesis is going to happen, but we don't have any rooted plants, only things like phytoplankton. Then we have the profundal zone, which is down here, and that's where it's too deep for sunlight. So there's not going to be any photosynthesis happening down here. And then lastly, the benthic zone, if you can see, it kind of goes around the whole thing. That's that murky bottom where we're going to have invertebrates like different bugs like mayflies, caddisflies, hellgrammites living, and that's going to have some very nutrient-rich sediments. So wetlands are an area where we're going to have soil submerged or saturated in water for part of the year at least, but it is shallow enough for emergent plants. So like I just said about the littoral zone, the plants there have to be adapted to live with roots submerged in standing water. Most plants are not able to do that. They essentially become suffocated. They can't get enough oxygen. But the plants that live here are able to do that. They're adapted to do that. So some benefits of wetlands that are going to be beneficial to us: they store excess water. So when there's big storms, it lessens the likelihood of floods. It recharges the groundwater. So as we use the groundwater up, this is going to be replacing some of that groundwater by absorbing rainfall. And the roots of those plants are going to filter pollutants and stop them from getting into that groundwater. And then lastly, that high amount of plant growth that's there is beneficial with photosynthesis, providing oxygen to us because there's lots of water and nutrients there. So lots of things can grow. So we've got some different types of wetlands. The first one's going to be a swamp. So in a swamp, we're going to have things like the cypress tree. These are pine trees, but they are adapted to be able to live in that water. Then we've got a marsh. So our marsh is going to be typically where we're going to see things like those reeds and cattails. And then the last one is a bog. Bogs have very acidic soil, so you're going to see things like spruce trees, sphagnum moss that are well adapted to live in that area. Estuaries. Estuaries are super important. These are where rivers empty into the ocean, so they're a mix of fresh and salt water. So the species are specially adapted to survive there. These are highly productive because they've got a lot of nutrients and sediments that are being deposited by the river. So a couple important things about those estuaries before I move on to the salt marsh is, number one, they help to create a floodplain. So the area where water will go when the rivers overflow. And then deltas, that's actually where the river opens into the ocean. And those two places have extremely fertile soil, which in the past has kind of tricked us a little bit because we would farm there, but then when they flood, our crops would be destroyed because we were growing things on a floodplain. So salt marshes, these are estuary habitats that are along coasts in temperate climates. They're super important. A lot of marine organisms will swim up into these marshes and lay their eggs and then go back to the ocean to live the rest of their lives. So it provides important nursery and habitat areas for fish and shellfish. And then our mangrove swamps are going to be along tropical climates. And those trees, sorry, I thought I had a picture of them here, are really cool because they have these long, like stilt-like roots, and those actually help to stabilize the shoreline and do the same thing by providing habitat for fish and shellfish. So with our coral reef, this is warm, shallow water. It's past the shoreline, and this is the most diverse marine ocean biome on Earth. It's a mutualistic relationship between the coral and the algae, like we already talked about. So I'm not going to sit here and explain that for a long period of time. So just know that they both rely on each other. Without the algae, the coral couldn't survive. Without the coral, the algae couldn't survive. Intertidal zones. So this is a narrow band of coast between high and low tide. So a lot of it gets exposed as the tide goes out. So this whole thing here would be considered the intertidal zone. So if it's high tide, the water would be all the way up here. But if it's low tide, it's going to be all the way down here. So organisms that live here have to be very well adapted. They have to be able to survive crashing waves and direct sunlight and heat during low tide. They're going to be underwater part of the time, but they're also going to be exposed to the sun during low tide. So some examples: barnacles, sea stars, crabs that can attach themselves to rock. They're all going to have special adaptations that help them to hold on. A lot of these are also going to have shells or a tough outer skin that's going to prevent desiccation, which is just drying out during low tide. Another example is the spiral wrack. So it's really cool. It's a plant. It's a type of seaweed. And so it's going to live up here in this high tide zone. But when the tide goes out, it's actually going to curl up. It's going to create this mucus that it's going to secrete, which actually acts like a moisturizer to help keep water in until that tide comes back. So each organism is going to be specially adapted to live in a certain area in the intertidal zones. Okay, the open ocean. The open ocean has very low productivity per area because only algae and phytoplankton can survive in most of the ocean. So when I say per area, if we were to take 1 kilometer of ocean and compare it to 1 kilometer of other biomes, it's going to be much less productive. But because it's so big, as that area combines, the algae and the phytoplankton that are out there are going to produce a lot of oxygen through photosynthesis. They're also going to absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. They act as a carbon sink. So that's going to help reduce the rate of climate change. The ocean also has some zones, okay? So we've got the photic zone, so that's where sunlight can reach. So that's where our photosynthesis is going to happen. We have the aphotic zone, or the abyssal zone, so that's too deep for sunlight. So a lot of organisms that live there are going to have adaptations that help them survive. They have to be adapted to very high pressures from all the water pushing down on them. A lot of them are bioluminescent, so they can see and navigate. And looking at your diagram over here, you can see we still have the benthic zone on the bottom, and then that intertidal zone is right along the edge. And then our photic zone and our aphotic zone. And our FRQ here is I want you to identify an organism that's found in an aquatic biome and explain how that organism is uniquely adapted to live in that biome. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. Have a good night.